Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum ji. We welcome you to the fourth episode of this mini series that we're doing from the platform of Ghamidi Center of Islamic Learning for Ramzan 2022. And we're hoping that the things we talk about are going to be of help to anyone who is seeking God, especially those people who are checking out Islam. So we hope, and who are checking out Quran. So we hope that what we talk about is going to be of help to you. This is a sequence discussion, so if you haven't seen the episode 1, 2, 3, please go see it and then see this episode. And for those viewers who are following our discussion, just to give you a summary, what we have talked about is the fact that if anybody is interested in seeking answers about God, existential questions, why should people see revealed religions over other ideologies? We talked a little bit about that. And obviously, given the time constraints, we can only talk in a summarized way as best as we can, encouraging people to go and then find these answers in this direction themselves. So we talked about the fact that why should people see revealed religion over other ideologies? Then we talked about the fact that within the framework of revealed religions, why should anybody see Quran or the mission or the teaching of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam over other traditions? We talked about that. We talked about Quran specifically, that why should anybody check it out? And then we talked about the fact that what kind of a book is the Quran in the first place, and how should one go reading it, one go about reading it. We talked about that. Very, very important points. So before I come to today's points, we know this is the final episode, so we're going to be talking about a lot of things, a lot of very important things. We're going to be talking about some misconceptions about the book itself, about the manuscript itself, the document itself, and some misconceptions about the message of Islam. We're going to be talking about this, and as usual, I have with me a very distinguished Quranic scholar, Dr. Shehzad Saleem Sahab. Sir, thank you so much for giving us your time.
It's my pleasure to be at your show.
Thank you, sir. So, sir, as we discussed, today we're going to be talking about some misconceptions about the book and the message. And when you talk about the book, I think you are the best person to talk to because you have addressed these issues in your book as well. Critical study of the history of the Quran, a critical study. I want to talk about the most famous misconception that Quran was actually compiled. It was in the form of scattered verses, and it was compiled and ordered at the time of Khalifa Hazrat Usman Razidallah Anhu. We say that that is not the case. It was compiled, it was in the form of a document at the time of the Prophet. Sir, over to you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is a very interesting debate, and actually, what you might come across here is the version or the history of the Quran based on narratives or hadith literature. And if you study hadith literature and the narratives which report the collection of the Quran and the way it was compiled, there would be no other conclusion than what you have just referred to, that yes, it was compiled or given its final shape the way we have it today in the times of the Caliph Usman. And this is the general perception of Muslim theologians. However, the Quran actually explicitly negates this, and it says that as far as the final shape and form of the Quran is concerned, it was compiled and finalized right in the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, before his demise. And there was this sequential, or you can say chronological revelation of the Quran, in which it was revealed piecemeal over a period of 22 years. And it was not compiled in the same sequence as it was revealed. During the last Ramadan of the Prophet's life, it was given a new sequence. And this new sequence was recited out by Gabriel to Prophet Muhammad, and Prophet Muhammad also recited it back to Gabriel. And then this new arrangement was the arrangement which was then, of course, memorized. We have surahs already being memorized, but in the last sequence, or you can say in the final arrangement, some of the surahs were placed in a certain order. So the surahs already had been memorized, but the new order that was given was also put to memory. And it was written down, it was memorized, it was read, it was taught. In other words, it was transferred to the living tradition of the Muslims by the Ramadan in after which the Prophet died, and we know that he was alive about for 4 or 5 months or 6 months after Ramadan, which is the ninth month. He died in Rabiul Awwal. Some sort of 5 months was still there in which this final sequence of the Quran was communicated, and that is how it was given its final shape. It is an absolute misconception to give this, I mean, to draw this conclusion that the Quran was the final shape that was given to the Quran was in the times of Caliph Usman. And I also like to clarify here that as far as our traditional scholars are concerned, their view is that the arrangement of the final chapters of the Quran or the final surahs of the Quran was actually done by the Sahaba, and the majority opinion is that it was done out of their ijtihad. So typically, the word that they use is that it is not tawqifi. So tawqifi means something which is from God. So the majority view of Muslim scholars is that as far as the verses within the surahs are concerned, that is a divine sequence. It has been divinely ordained. But then, as far as the surahs are concerned, the sequence of the surah, this was, as I said, the majority opinion is that this was given by the Sahaba in the times of Usman when he actually collected the Quran in the form of a codex. And as I just said, that this is generally because of historical narratives which give this picture. And in my own work, I have analyzed these narratives and shown how dubious they are. They are not authentically transmitted at all. And also, in the light of the Quran's own verdict regarding its own collection, the Quran actually gives this verdict that it was given this final shape in the time of the Prophet. And then that final shape or sequence was transmitted, as I said, both in the oral form and in the written form to the rest of the Muslims, which came after the Sahaba.
Okay, so you're saying that before Prophet ﷺ left this world, he gave everyone who was present at that time the same Quran, this manuscript with the same
Absolutely.
order. Okay,
Absolutely.
that because it's a very prevalent, unfortunately, very prevalent misconception within the Muslim world. And again, to our viewers, if you want to go into the details, please do check out the works of Dr. Shehzad Saleem Saab, especially the history of the Quran, a critical study. And also, you could check out the works of Javed Ahmed Ghamidi Saab. And if you are a English-speaking person, you could check out Ghamidi Saab's English translations by Dr. Shehzad Saleem Saab. He's translated, I think you've translated all of his books more or less into English, I think, Dr. Saab?
Sorry, almost all of them, yes.
Oh, wow, that's a wonderful service. So you could check those books out, his book out for the details of this. So Quran was given exactly in this form as a document by Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam before he left this world. So could you shed some light then what happened at the time of Hazrat Usman that became this legend that Quran was compiled in his time? What happened? Was there some waqia that happened at his time?
Well, you see, all that Usman and the rest of the caliphs did, it seems, was that they disseminated the various codices of the Quran which were written down. So you see, it was the responsibility of the state. One important thing that needs to be understood is that when the Prophet passed away, he left an empire. And a very conservative estimate shows that there were about 60,000 Sahaba who he left behind, and a more, a more, I would say, a less conservative estimate says that there were more than 100,000. So you can see that this not only this was the amount of people who received the Quran, but also there was an empire in which, of course, when it was in place, it had its duty to spread this Quran far and wide to people who were converting, to young minds who were, growing up and wanted to read the Quran and understand the Quran. So we know that the Caliph Umar, for example, for the first time, he commissioned Quran teachers, and from public treasury, he paid them. And as Quran teachers, he sent them to various parts of the empire. And it seems that in the times of Caliph Usman, there were some codices who were, you see, in those times, it was people used to write the Quran from their hands. And it does seem that in the time of Caliph Usman, some spurious codices came to surface in which it was realized that they were not properly copied, and some of the marks or some of the letters were not properly represented, and at times there was something which was left out. So the Caliph Usman made a very special contribution by having those obliterated when he found them, and at the same time he sped up. He actually increased the momentum of writing more Qurans and having them spread to all parts of the empire. And this actually, what he did as a responsibility of a caliph, spreading the message of the Quran and the codex of the Quran, because it was reported in a way as if this was done as a result of some differences which arose in a battle in Armenia and Azerbaijan. There is an incident which is reported. So it generally came to be known that the endeavor of Caliph Usman was not something in which he was spreading the Quran. It was more of an endeavor in which he realized that people were reading it wrongly, and he became alarmed that perhaps there were a lot of differences and discrepancies, and therefore he needed to do something in a very at a very large scale. This is a wrong, I would say, representation of what actually happened. What best can be said is that his effort was to spread the Quran far and wide, and there were some small areas, or possibly some instances, in which it was erroneously copied. Because you see, they didn't have printing press the way we have it today, or computers in which things could be copy pasted. They had to be handwritten, and at times the proofreading, which means that you reread what you have written, would cause a lot of mistakes because people would at times not be very careful in copying the Quran. So that is what that he did. And like every caliph, and any caliph who would be responsible in spreading the right codices, that was his contribution. But it came to be viewed in a different light, as if he had become alarmed at large scale differences erupting all over the empire, and something being done in order to circumvent this. And it was more of a measure in which, I mean, he realized that he should have done something, and suddenly it came to his mind that, well, because of this war which is happening and people are reading it wrongly, he must jump into this whole endeavor. Whereas I think what had actually happened was that, as a responsibility of any caliph, he took great pains and went to great lengths in disseminating these codices far and wide.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So he disseminated the book that Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam gave to, the conservative estimates say 60,000, and other estimates say 100,000, more than 100,000 of his companions. And all that happened in Caliph Usman's time was that he disseminated this into this
Far and
now
wide.
new vast empire that literally stretched from one end of the world to another. That's all that happened, guys. So there is, I hope that this misconception has been addressed. Now, coming to the next one, because they're both, I believe, connected, that we do know that variant readings exist of the Quran. What that means is there are other versions of Quran which exist, which have words written slightly differently, which are pronounced slightly differently. So how do you see the existence of these variant readings? What exactly are these variant readings? And how does the existence of these various variant readings stand up to the Quran's claim, as God has claimed in the Quran, that it is I who has sent down this Quran and it is I who will protect it? So do you think that in the words of those who don't believe in the Quran, that God failed to protect the Quran or its integrity? Because here you go, variant readings exist, even though they're not very prevalent, but well, they do exist. Sir.
So you see, we just need to understand the process of the revelation of the Quran, and also at the same time realize that the Quran was transmitted at times by human beings through written codices of the Quran, in which in some cases they were not properly copied. So if I give you some detail about this process, as I just mentioned, that the Quran was not revealed in one go. It was revealed in installments. So you see, over a period of 22 years, various episodes and various surahs of the Quran were revealed, and later on they were given a new sequence, a new compilation, a new arrangement, so to speak. Now, this previous arrangement was abandoned. It was abandoned. And the Quran actually told the Prophet explicitly that once the Quran would be revealed, it will be given a new sequence. And you know what? This happened in Mecca. This is actually mentioned in Surah Qiyamah, which is a Meccan surah, and an early Meccan surah. So the Prophet was told well before the completion of the Quran that it would be revealed piecemeal, it will be revealed in various episodes, And then near the end, it would be given a new sequence. So the Quranic words are Inna alayna jam'ahu wa Qur'ana. The Almighty says that don't worry, it will be revealed the way it is being revealed, like this in various sequences. Then Almighty says it is my responsibility. Alayna jam'ahu. It is my responsibility. It is our responsibility. And then the Quran says, فَإِذَا قَرَأْنَاهُ فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنَهُ. So once this new arrangement is given, you have to follow this new arrangement. Forget about the previous arrangement. So one of the origins of these variant readings was that when the Quran was being revealed in it chronologically and given a new shape, obviously some of the verses would have been given some new shape, or maybe some of the verbs would have slightly changed. Some of the letters, like the fa, would have been converted into a wa. Similarly, a direct address could be converted into an indirect address. So, because of the fact that the chronological sequence of the Quran, or the revelatory sequence of the Quran, was given a new arrangement, some of the previous verses, which had slightly different letters, as I said, because of these reasons, they still existed because the companions memorized them, and out of their sincerity, they transmitted that sequence as well, or part of that sequence as well. And of course, with this, in my understanding, with this clarity, that well, this is what we heard the Quran previously, and this is how it was revealed. But now this is the new sequence in which you have to follow it. So the Quran was actually, you can say, given in that new sequence to the Ummah. But at the same time, some of the previous verses, or previous forms of verses of the previous sequence, were also transmitted by the Sahaba to the next generation as an academic thing, as a historical, I would say, a prized possession, that this is how historically the Quran progressed. And then these variants, which were slightly, like, for example, you say ta'alamun, it became ya'lamun, the fa became a wa, kazzabun became yakzibun. So the revelatory sequence that was abandoned, but still remained in the minds of the Sahaba, and it was transmitted, not that it was the Quran, but just as an academic archival thing, as all of us would like to preserve. And the second source was, of course, I would say are the scribes, who, when they copied the Quran, they at times made certain very small errors, and those errors were actually they actually became readings in themselves. And because of the fact that in the earliest times we didn't have declensions, which means the Arab, and words could be pronounced in slightly different ways and still make sense. So at times the copyists, they would erroneously copy certain letters in such ways. And I think the third instance was, obviously, that cannot be ruled out. Any Hafiz will attest to this, and that is, we have similar portions of the Quran spread out. I mean, verses which are similar to each other, slightly different, but very similar, in which at times a word is preposed or postposed, which means in one surah, the same word would occur before a certain word, and in another surah after a certain word. So similar verses of various surahs got mixed up. And this we can find even today, when the Huffaz or the memorizers are reciting the Quran, they actually at times connect to some similar verse, and they start reading that, and then someone corrects them that, yes, this is something else that you should read. It's only because of some similarity that you are jumping to a new verse. So similarity in certain verses of the Quran, which was found in various surahs, at times also led to those readings. And they were transmitted, as I said, by people not as the Quran, but, as I said, either because they thought it was of historical importance, or they genuinely made an error, or because of forgetfulness. And this material was transmitted, but at the same time, the real Quran, or the actual Quran, which was given that new shape, was transmitted in a way that what we call, it was transmitted from one generation to another generation. Thousands of people transmitting it to the next generation. This, in technical term, is called tawatur, or perpetuation, concurrent perpetuation. So the Quran that we have today has this property of concurrent perpetuation. But on the other hand, as I said, these isolate reports were also transmitted. Although they were transmitted at times inadvertently, as I said, because of some error, or at times with this specification that, well, this was how the previous revelatory sequence was. But in the next generations, this got mixed up and the line got blurred. And what was transmitted as maybe something of an academic importance became to be known as the actual Quran. So this is how these verses started to infiltrate. And by the end of the first century, you could find a large number of them being in circulation. But this was in contradistinction to the fact that the Quran that we have today, and which we as the common man and the common masses read, is something which is transmitted by such a large number of people that the general masses don't even have the knowledge of those variant readings, simply because they were confined to scholars and they were confined to people to whom these reports were transmitted, one to the other, to the third, and to the fourth person. You have a scenario in which there are two transmissions of the Quran. One, which is the perpetual and the large-scale transmission from generation to generation, which is the Quran that we all know, we read, we memorize, and we teach. And then there were these variant readings who arose because of these reasons that I just said, and they became part of our tafsir books. They became part of our hadith books. And later on in the third century, actually, there were scholars who were called Sahibul Ikhtiyar, which mean that they actually selected from the whole Quran each verse the way they thought was the right transmission of the Quran. And as a result, Abu Bakr ibn Mujahid, a very famous scholar, he selected seven of these Sahibul Ikhtiyar, which means they could exercise their own opinion in picking and choosing which of the options of a verse was better to them grammatically at times, or closer to them because of certain other reasons. And then a whole system came into being in which we got complete versions of the Quran being compiled and being read. And we even find that there are about 11 countries in which these systematic versions came to be implemented for reasons that I can discuss, or I can elaborate. But because your question is confined to the fact that how come these variant readings came into being, and how much their proliferation today is there and it abounds. So this is how I understand, and obviously it is an explanation and an understanding that I base on the understanding of my teachers, starting off with Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi, an exceptional personality. And I think he is the person who has to be given credit, because he, first of all, pointed out this verse of Surah Qiyamah, which was being grossly misunderstood because of certain other reasons. And he said that, look here, this is what the history of the Quran is by the Quran itself. This is what the Quran is describing about its own self. And this seems to be an ignored verse. So about a century ago, he was the person who pointed this out. And then he actually systematically pointed out how this verse delineates the history of the Quran.
Sorry, you're talking about that verse? You're talking about that verse where God says, "It is I who has revealed Quran.
Yes,
we will gather it, we will reorder it, and then we will authorize it."
So that is the verse. So unfortunately, what happened was that particular verse was interpreted in a different meaning, and it was interpreted through an asar. Asar means the explanation of a Sahabi. So Abdullah ibn Abbas actually explained, or allegedly explained. I have shown in my work that this is an incorrect ascription to Abdullah ibn Abbas, and in all probability this is not correct. But what is generally thought to be ascribed to him was that when it is said inna alayna jam'ahu wa qur'ana, it actually meant that Abdullah ibn Abbas is saying that the Almighty is telling the Prophet that don't worry, you will not the memory that you have, it will not fail you, and you will not forget the Quran. I will have it compiled in your heart. So basically, inna alayna jam'ahu, the verse was understood to mean that the Almighty is assuring the Prophet that he will have it collected in his heart and he will not forget it. So something related to memorization and forgetfulness. So I have analyzed that narrative and shown that not only its ascription to Abdullah ibn Abbas is very dubious, but the words themselves, they don't give the same understanding as has been generally understood. But because of another reason, I may point out that our scholars, they think that whenever they have to interpret the Quran, the best possible interpretation of the Quran is through a Sahabi's explanation or a companion's explanation. So when they found that Abdullah ibn Abbas had said something like this, and because this narrative was recorded in an outstanding book as Bukhari, which is of course something which when our scholars generally come across, they would not leave it out. So when they thought that Abdullah ibn Abbas is explaining this verse in a different way. So this verse never figured in the history of the Quran. It never became a part of any chapter written on the history of the Quran because it was understood in a different way. So Imam Farahi actually he pointed out that look at the context of the verse, look at the words which are used by the Quran, and look at the parallel verses which actually reinforce this understanding from other instances in the Quran. And if you do so, you will conclude that Quran itself is not silent on its own history. The Quran is very much vocal. And as I said earlier on, in a Meccan surah, earlier on in the Prophet's life, he was communicated this message, not only to him, but to the Sahaba as well, that remember this arranged in a manner that you would understand that it's a different sequence from the revelatory sequence. So the Prophet was already in of knowledge. I mean, he was pretty much aware that this is what the history of the revelation of the Quran is going to be. And therefore, I think that credit goes to Ustaz Aminuddin Farahi. People can differ with his analysis, but as for me, I think that he has done an outstanding service by pointing this out and by actually giving us this barometer that when the Quran says that the final arrangement has to be followed, it is actually referring and telling us that that final arrangement, which was transmitted by the rest of the ummah, is the one which is to be followed. Those isolated reports were actually needed; they were actually needed to be abandoned because you look what the words of the Quran are. فَإِذَا قَرَأْنَاهُ فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنَهُ. So when we read the Quran in this new sequence, you follow this new sequence. Forget about the previous one. So what has happened is because of the fact that this verse was not interpreted in this way. I mean, this guidance was never understood. That the Quran is actually telling us to leave all other verses, leave all other arrangements, leave all other variants, and follow the final sequence. Had this been the understanding of the earliest scholars, I think the issue of variant readings would have been solved much earlier. But because of the fact that this verse of the Quran was understood in a different way, and it took 12 centuries for a person to arrive and set right its interpretation, that we now can safely say that yes, there are two transmissions of the Quran. If there are variant readings, they exist because of certain reasons. But the Quran itself has told us to abandon them. They are more either of an academic nature or erroneous transmissions, or as I said, they have resulted because of not being properly transmitted. So I think this is his contribution, which has really made the promise which what you just referred to earlier on, that the Quran says that inna nahnu nazzalna zikra wa inna lahu lahafizun, that we have revealed this zikr or this Quran and we are responsible to protect it. I mean, this is something, if we read this verse and we read, and at the same time we view these various versions of the Quran, we would have serious doubts about the promise of the Almighty, that how can this promise be true in the presence of so many versions. And I think this is one of the greatest contributions with Ustaz Farahi has made by making us realize that yes, the Quran is protected. It is the same Quran that was revealed, and the rest are the rest of the readings. They can be explained. They have an origin, and that origin has to be taken in its proper perspective. And if you don't take it in its proper perspective, you will make a complete mess out of the history of the Quran.
Absolutely. And when I was looking into this matter, I'm glad that these variant readings survive to this day. Otherwise, there would have been so many legends and misconceptions about how there are different Qurans with different messages in them. Because as I do understand, even those variant readings have absolutely nothing different as far as the message of the Quran is concerned. It's very small
Right.
changes of some words. Is that true, sir?
Absolutely true. And this is a further proof that, I mean, had there been any variance, some variance in meaning, some novelty in meaning, one would have said, yeah, well, yes, the Almighty is saying things in novel ways or different ways or unique ways. What actually you find is these are, I mean, these are non-entities virtually. These differences, very few of them make a difference I would say a great difference in meaning. Yes, I would not say that the meaning doesn't change. There are a couple of instances where there is a reasonably serious difference of meaning, but the
Could you
rest,
give
I
one
mean, thousands
example,
of
sir? One example,
For
maybe, so
example,
that the audience can
very,
know that what kind of a difference in meaning that we're talking about.
so a
Let's
very
say that the
common
most profound one. Let's talk about the most profound one.
So a very common example is the ayat of the wuzu, the verses of wuzu, in which you will find one version of this Quran saying arjulakum and another verse saying arjulakum and arjulakum. Arjul means your legs or your feet, to be precise. So if you read the Quran in one way, you will find that it means that you need to wipe your feet. Don't need to wash your feet while doing wuzu. And if you read it in another way, it would mean that washing the feet is essential. So arjulakum and arjulakum is one difference. And then, of course, there is another difference of UC and USA, which are the inheritance verses, the Kalala verses, which is slightly more technical. And if you read the Quran according to these this technical difference in share or a difference in meaning of the word Kalala would actually result. So these are a couple of major ones, but the rest they are virtually things that are synonymous. And one would hardly imagine that if there was to be a variance or some variation, it should have some novelty, something unique, something enthralling. But lo and behold, this is not the case. And in all probability, as I said, either these are scribal errors or they are, erroneous transmissions from memory or similar. I have shown in my book actually that how similar verses of the Quran have affected, and as a result of those similar verses, how our later readers have amalgamated them or mixed them up and formed a separate system of reading. I've given several examples and shown that how human memory at times falters, and if you give it divine sanction, then you can do nothing. Otherwise, it can be easily explained. But as I said, these are centuries-old views, and to challenge them is one hell of a task. That because you see, first of all, you'll be going against your own scholarship. So when you talk about Western scholars and you speak to them, and people like me or people from whom I have learned, we are in an absolute minority. And obviously, if there is anything that we can present or which can appeal to the Western scholars, is the reasoning that we can offer, because that doesn't depend on a minority or a majority opinion. But the question, of course, which arises is that we are very marginalized. I mean, very few people who have these voices. Otherwise, 99.9% people are presenting the history of the Quran the way you have just portrayed it, that as if it was haphazardly arranged, and a lot of, it was not done in a very meticulous way, and we have variant readings which are equally, they are equated with the Quran. So scholars about in the third or fourth century, they came up just as they came up with standards which ratify a hadith. You would know that in order to classify a hadith as a correct report, they made up certain standards. They fixed or prescribed certain standards. In a very similar way, they prescribed three standards for variant readings as well. And they said that if these three standards are met, then they will be regarded equivalent to the Quran. So amongst those three standards was that, first of all, their Arabic has to be correct. Secondly, the isnad is to be correct, that it reaches back to the Prophet, the chain of narration of these readings. And thirdly, that they must be in conformity with one of the Usmanic codices. We know that he wrote 4 or 5 codices, and all of them had variation. So the third criteria was that it should be in accordance with one of the Usmanic codices. So they said that if they qualified these three criteria, then they would be regarded as Quran. And so, therefore, when those systems of reading, which I just talked a little while ago about, when they came into being, so we found them as whole systems being published in those countries. So, in North Africa, for example, the reading of Nafi, who's a famous scholar of the Quran, is in vogue. And if you go there and you're a hafiz or a memorizer, and you see them reading the Quran, and you have the Quran in your own memory as well, you'll find those conflicting words. So I had happened to go to Morocco when I was doing my research, and I stayed there and I visited the shuyukh there and the scholars. And there is a tradition in Morocco in which you sit down after the Fajr and Maghrib prayer, and you recite the Quran from the Codex every day, and you finish the Quran in 30 days. So you recite half a sipara after the Fajr prayer and half a sipara after the Maghrib prayer. So I have some parts of the Quran committed to my memory. So with the permission of the sheikh or the imam of the mosque, I used to take a tape recorder and used to place it there. and we would recite the Quran from our memories or from the codex. And when we used to do so, and I would rehear that recording, I could see my voice standing out in certain instances because I had a different version or a different memory of the same verse, and the rest of the chorus was having a different memory. And I recorded it, and when I discussed it with the Sheikh, he said that this is how it was revealed, and your Quran is absolutely correct, and our Quran is also absolutely correct. And and what happened was that these Qurans came to be published. So we have five versions of the Quran today. One that we are used to, and according to my understanding and calculation, about 97% of our Muslim Ummah, close to that maybe, is reading this Quran. And the rest of the 3 or 4% are reading the four other Qurans, which have been published by the Saudi authorities, by the Mujamma al Fahad, which is a famous publishing company of the Quran. So they have published those other four Qurans. And the people who come from those countries, for example, a Moroccan Haji, when he would visit the Holy Kaaba for Umrah or Hajj, he would be gifted the copy that he reads in his country, and that would be different from what we read. So in my library here and in my computer also, I have all those versions with me, and not only in published form but also in soft copies, because it's important to analyze them and discuss them. So when this happened around in the 1960s, when Saudi Arabia actually published these versions, it became even more prominent that yes, Muslims support all these versions of the Quran to be equal to one another. Yes, there is one version which is much more prevalent, but it's not that the other ones have to be rejected. And so now, when we have to talk to Western scholars or we have to talk regarding the history of the Quran, first of all, we have to explain to them how this came about in our own history. Why Muslims themselves, I mean, you have to negate your own scholarship at times and criticize them and tell them that how, I mean, this came into existence. And it becomes an onerous task, to be honest, to first criticize our own history and then present this history to people who are not used to what we are presenting. Because as you would be knowing, that Bible has more than one versions, and yes, it doesn't exist in its original language. But then you see the debate, the doors to this debate is they are very easily open. And if we say that the Bible has more than one version, the answer that you would obviously get is that yes, the Quran also has more than one version, and it doesn't matter if there is one version which is more prevalent, but the fact is that there are other versions, and which of them is the correct one? And what about the promise of God? Is it about all these versions, and how did they come about? And then there is also some more details, which of course maybe the common audience would be not very familiar with. That, for example, there are issues which relate to concoction of Quranic verses. So there were certain verses which were even concocted, and although we don't find them in ordinary books or in general terms, but there are instances in which they have their own existence. And because once you open the door to variant readings, I mean, you just cannot stop it from spreading towards ill intent. And I think this ill intent also found its way at times to disparage the sanctity of the Quran.
Okay, perfect. I think we shed very detailed light on this matter. And before we run out of time, we have many more things to discuss. Again, if you want to see the details of these things, you can check out Dr. Saab's book, or you can check out Ghamidi Saab's literature on this. So let us move forward. Sir, this is a very important point, because I think that all kinds of deviant interpretations within Islam result from this very point that I'm about to discuss with you. There is a very prevalent misconception that the Quran cannot be understood on its own. You have to see the Quran from the lens of, let's say, historical literature like the Hadith, or the interpretations or the tafsirs of big scholars of the past. On its own, Quran is not understandable, and it has to be read from the lens of other literature. But that goes against the Quran itself, against the claim of Quran itself, that every other literature has to be understood from the lens of the Quran. So please, your comment on this, and how important is this point as far as the existence of all these various apparently contradicting interpretations of Islam are concerned?
Well, you see, the Quran was revealed for the guidance of mankind. And very in the very first surah, which is the second surah, which is Surah Baqarah, it says Hudallin Nas. It is guidance for mankind. It is guidance for the rest of the world. And there is no mention of this guidance that it needs any supplementary understanding of other things, like, for example, the Hadith literature or historical narratives or maybe some other disciplines. It is as simple as that. It was revealed by the Almighty for the guidance of mankind. It was revealed in eloquent Arabic. The Quran stresses at so many instances that it says that it was revealed in Arabiy Mubin. Arabiy Mubin means eloquent Arabic, which can be understood by everyone, by every person. He can understand or she can understand that. And there is absolutely no concept of the fact that you need some support, some extraneous support like Hadith literature to understand the Quran. This is something which has been erroneously misunderstood because of certain verses. Otherwise, we would have a tafsir of the Quran from the Prophet being transmitted the way the Quran has been transmitted, because this would mean that the Quran itself is not sufficient for us to be understood, and hence the Prophet should have sat down or would have sat down and explained each and every verse, and that too should have been compiled the very way the Quran has been compiled. Because if the understanding of the Quran is to be relied on the Prophet's words, then they had to be preserved equally, like the Quran was preserved. So on the one hand, we have the Quran, and we of course cannot deny it. And on the other hand, we should have had a complete explanation of the Quran from the Prophet's mouth, compiled and arranged the way and transmitted in the way that would have rendered it free from any fault. Do we have any such thing? Obviously not. So you see, this claim is not only baseless as regards the theological aspect is concerned, even in its practical aspect, it stands nullified. We don't have any such explanation. The Prophet never needed to have given this explanation, because the Quran says that whatever I speak or whatever God speak is in absolutely clear Arabic. All you need to do is understand it. So unfortunately, because of this, what has happened is that instead of having direct recourse to the Quran, instead of reading the Quran, if you're not able to understand Arabic, then, for example, through a translation, what generally happens is that our tafsir books, they are voluminous tafsir books which rely on ahadith literature, and the biggest of these ahadith books which have these narrations is the tafsir of Tabari, a person who existed, who was in the 4th century, and he has a 30-volume tafsir, and most of the narrations of this tafsir are from the Sahaba, I mean, or the Tabi'un. And in fact, I can safely say that maybe more than 70% of the narrations are from the Tabi'un, which means the generation after the Sahaba. So very few narrations from the Prophet, even few from the mouth of the companions, but yes, a lot from the third generation of from the Prophet. And they are expressing certain views about certain verses. And you'll find that in Tabri's tafsir, a lot of these aqwal, as we call them, statements of explanation from the tabi'un, to be spurious, to be of dubious authenticity. And people have critically reviewed this tafsir as well, and pointed out how a lot of it has spurious material. Thus, about 3 centuries later, Hafiz ibn Kasir, a very famous personality, he wrote his tafsir, and he actually omitted a lot of those narratives which were found in the tafsir of Tabri, and he shortened it, so to speak. And so a 30-volume tafsir written by Tabri was shortened to a 5-volume tafsir written by Ibn Kasir, omitting a lot of material. But still, the material which Ibn Kasir has is not all, I mean, all of it is not authentic. And a lot of tafsiri narratives, they are spurious, they are of doubtful authenticity, and people have criticized them. And we have scholars who say that there are three things in these narratives which don't have any basis, and one of them are those narratives which belong to the tafsir genre. So this is how the general attitude has been, that to understand the Quran through these hadith narratives, whereas there is no sanction of this methodology within the Quran. It is something which is, as I said, misunderstood from the Quran. Certain verses, according to people, do tell us that we have to study the Quran through the hadith. But if we go into details, I can explain that of course they do not have this meaning. But other than that, You see, it's this is such a commonplace and a common sense approach in which the Quran, I mean, it shouts out loud that it is guidance for all mankind. And if that guidance falls short, then what exactly was God trying to reveal to us if it needed the support of some other explanatory literature? And that too is missing. I mean, as I said, had this been the case, we should have an equal number, a bigger tafsir of the Quran being transmitted the way the Quran itself it has been transmitted, so that we could consult that tafsir first and then said, well, these verses of the Quran, they have to be understood in the light of what this tafsir has been said. We don't have any such tafsir. And to be honest, I can tell you out of my own experience that if you study the explanations which are offered by the Prophet himself, they are so few in number. And most of them have arisen not because the Prophet himself took notice or wanted to give a lecture. It was because at times people would go to him and ask him that what do you understand of this? So it was basically an initiative, not from the Prophet. It was an initiative which as students we go to our teacher and ask certain questions. So it was basically an initiative from the students, and went to the teacher. Had it been something of a mandatory nature, the Prophet would have sat down. He wouldn't have waited for any such initiative. He would have taken the initiative himself, and he would have said, look here, this is the Quran. You would not be able to understand it directly. So listen to me. This is his explanation. So do we find any such thing? Absolutely not.
Perfect, perfect. I think we talked about this in great detail. And I also believe that if one stands on the interpretation that Quran can only be understood if you read piles and piles of literature, then unfortunately you're saying that Quran is not sent as guidance for all mankind. Quran is only sent as guidance for very, very learned scholars. So that what it does is it takes Quran out of the grasp of a common layman. So that goes against the very claim of the Quran itself, that Quran is the Mizan, the Burhan, the Furqan, through which every other thing will be judged, and it is guidance for all mankind, for a layman, for a scholar, for a scientist, for everybody. So I think we have talked about that. Again, if people want to see the details, you can check out the detailed work which is in your book and in the works of Javed Ghamidi Saab. We should move forward now because we're running out of time. So, sir,
Right.
last but not the least, I want to talk about some misconceptions about the very message itself. Some prevalent interpretations, which unfortunately, again, we're not saying that we Muslims are free from blame for twisting the message of God. I think we are to blame. A lot of us are to blame because these interpretations that I'm going to talk to you now are very actually prevalent interpretations throughout the Muslim world, unfortunately. And let me also assure the audiences that this was also predicted by the Prophet ﷺ, that like nations before you, majority of Muslims eventually will also fall into deviation. So it was all predicted, nothing new. So, sir, let's talk about some interpretation, but in pointers. In pointers, for example, it is said that slavery, Quran or Islam, allows slavery, but we say it does not allow slavery. It managed the existing slavery and it prohibited new slavery and hence eliminated it. But majority of the Islamic scholarship agrees that Islam allows slavery. What do you have to say about that, sir?
Well, this is an unfortunate instance in which a religion which was revealed to proscribe and prohibit and do away with this inhuman institution is actually guilty of promoting it. I mean, I can talk about it at length, but I think the important point that we need to understand is that slavery was part and parcel of the Arabic society. I mean, there were scores of slaves in every household and of all ages, and they had become virtually part of the house. And any immediate order of their emancipation would have resulted in a lot of problems because the women slaves that they were not very morally sound, and the men slaves that they were not very capable. Many of them were not capable for earning for themselves. So an immediate order of their emancipation or liberation would have resulted in not only an economic burden on the society, but also immorality being spreading because these women who were of loose character, these slave maidens, they would have gone and opened up prostitution dens, and you can see the havoc they would have played. So what happened was that Islam adopted a gradual policy, a gradual methodology of eliminating slavery. And as you referred yourself, the first thing it did was that it stopped immediately the induction of new slaves. And this happened when it said that whenever you capture prisoners of war, you just cannot make them slaves. So the greatest source of slavery of those times were these wars in which free men and women were captured and they were converted into slaves. So, at the very first battle, which was the Battle of Badr, which took place between Muslims and the disbelievers, the Quranic injunction was revealed that you cannot capture prisoners of wars and convert them into slaves. So the words are imma manna ba'du wa imma fida, that you have to set them free. Obviously, the war criminals would be tried, but as far as captured prisoners are concerned, you have to release them either on ransom or without ransom. There is no question of converting them into slaves at any cost. So any new slavery or any new element of slaves being inducted was immediately done away with. Now the question remained was that the slaves which remained, which were there and which were existed out of their own will maybe, or which who wanted to liberate themselves, how the Quran went about and actually set them free. So it made an appeal to the society and said that fakku rakaba, go and liberate slaves. It gave various orders to Muslims. For example, it told Muslims that whatever you eat and whatever your standard of living is, you must equate your standard of living to your slaves, which of course would be very difficult to maintain. And the purpose was that people would liberate the slaves, because how can my own standard of living, I mean, it would not be affordable for people. And similarly, it was said that these slave men and women should be married off with one another. And then finally, this directive was revealed, in which it was said that if a slave would guarantee that he would not become an economic burden, and also at the same time would give the slave the money from which it was bought a certain guarantee, and he asked for emancipation, then it was incumbent upon his master to set him free. So you see, during this interim period in which slavery was given protection, the verses of the Quran that became a cause of this misconception were that sexual relations can be established with illa ala azwajihim aw ma malakat aymanuhum, which means that believers, they don't go to any other women except to their own wives and to their own slave women. So the word slave women was meant for this interim period in which slavery was being gradually eradicated until that final directive was given that you have to set them free if they want to. Yes, if they want themselves to stay with you, then that is fine. But what happened was that at two instances in the Quran, it speaks of the fact that men can go near their women, I mean their wives and their slave women. And instead of thinking this to be that interim directive that was given in that period in which that gradual elimination was taking place, most of our scholars thought that this is an eternal directive, which means that whenever you catch prisoners of war and you can convert them into slaves, and then you can have intimacy with them as well, not realizing the fact that this particular directive, as I said, was given in that interim period, and that interim was necessary because such was the deeply rooted nature of slavery that an immediate order of its cancellation would have resulted in tremendous problems for the society. So, by not understanding this gradual eradication of slavery, the mindset or the understanding of Muslims was that yes, slaves can still be made, and this is still the prevalent understanding, unfortunately. And
Very,
out of
very unfortunate.
yes,
Yes,
and
very
history bears
unfortunately.
witness.
And sorry to overlap you, sir. Please continue.
So I said that history bears witness that in the times of the Prophet himself, this never happened. So there are several instances in which, when the slaves were when prisoners of war were captured, they were at times the Prophet waited for people to come and set for the other side to come and take them back. He waited for several days, and this was something which was carried out in his own times. There were certain exceptions which can be talked about, but by and large, this rule was followed, and slavery was thought to be eliminated, or actually the Quran intended to be had it eliminated. But unfortunately, because of this wrong understanding, and as human beings, of course, we can make this wrong call. This institution, which is an inhuman institution, which is something that we I mean, even shudder of when we think of it, still exists theoretically in the minds of Muslim scholars. And today, if very interestingly, I can narrate you a story of my own professor of, I was in my university days, my physics professor, and this is about maybe 35 years ago. So in our physics class, a professor, a Stanford PhD, a very accomplished professor of physics, he once came into our class and he said that this was the time when Pakistan and India were at daggers drawn in 1984, when Indira Gandhi was the prime minister, and Pakistan and India, they were having these war exercises, and it looked as if war was imminent. And one fine day, we find our professor, may God be kind to him, he's no more in this world. He said, "Well, if there is a war between India and Pakistan, I'm going to capture Indira Gandhi and make him my londi, and she is going to be my slave woman." And all of us we were flabbergasted. We were totally, I mean, shocked that look, here is a professor, very, very well educated, not very religious, but the mindset is the same. That if there is going to be a war, we will capture women and make them slave women. Such is the rampant understanding of this concept, and it is we have to do a lot to make people understand that the Quran or Islam does not at all stand for this.
Absolutely, and it has real world implications as well. We all know that how Daesh took sex slaves in Iraq and Syria and put up markets for selling and buying women as sex slaves. And it comes as a very shock and surprise to a lot of Muslims when they hear that, yes, in the prevalent interpretation of Islam, most of the scholars say that, yes, slavery is allowed in Islam. And we represent actually a minority when we say that, no, absolutely not. In Quran, God managed the existing slavery, and I think Hazrat Maria Kiptiya was also dealt the same way as per the law of managing existing slavery, because we know that Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was barred and prohibited from marrying by that time that Maria Kiptiya was given as a gift to Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So there were laws to deal with existing slavery. The door to bring in more slaves was closed. Freeing a slave was made compulsory once you see that the slave is able to able to feed themselves, to be economically independent, not be a burden on the muashara, on the society. So yeah, that's how Allah Ta'ala wanted to eliminate slavery in one generation. But it's so unfortunate that slavery was not only allowed but practiced not just by Muslim common people, but by kings and by emperors, and it was sanctioned by scholars as to be okay. That is, I think, one of the biggest deviations that we as Muslims have done to the message of the Quran, that we have said that, well, our God, our Quran allows slavery and especially men to make women sex slaves. We're here to say that is absolutely not the case. Anyway, sir, this was very important. This was very important. So we spent a lot of time on this. Moving forward, misconception number 2, that Quran asks Muslims to wage war on non-Muslims for the purpose of spreading Islam, and those non-Muslims then who don't accept Islam have to pay this tax called jizya, which is mandatory on non-Muslims, and this has to happen till the Day of Judgment, and Muslims cannot be very good friends with non-Muslims. Sir, what do you have to say about that?
So I think this is again a huge misconception and something that needs a lot of clarification, because there are many verses in the Quran itself which speak of not making friends with non-Muslims, not only not making friends but waging war, as you said, which is much more serious in nature. And in fact, the ideal which is given to Muslims is that they should create a global Islamic empire and make other religions submit to them. And this is something which has arisen by not understanding certain verses of the Quran. Actually, what we need to understand is that the religious history of mankind is divided into two broad areas. So one is the prophetic area, which means the prophetic time is the time from the Prophet Adam to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is the prophetic era in which prophets of God used to come. And then we have a post-prophetic era, which is from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to the Day of Judgment. And then we have that Judgment Day. So the prophetic era, the post-prophetic era, and the judgment day. So the judgment day has, of course, is as the name itself shows, is a time when people will be judged for their actions. They will be rewarded and punished. What happens is that we tend to lose track of this accountability, that we will be held accountable one day. So, what God did was that to make this accountability of the hereafter something which could be visually observed, He created these smaller days of judgment in the times of the messengers of God. And this they would do by delivering the message of God as His envoys, and then answering any objections that people might have, and then punishing those people who deliberately would deny the truth. And this deliberate denial would be something which they could not have discovered from their own selves because it relates to the heart. It was the Almighty who would tell them that now, once you have delivered the truth to them, you have answered their objections. Now they are denying out of arrogance. They have they have nothing to say. And this, in Quranic terms, is also called Itmamul Hujjah, which means conclusive communication of the truth. So, for such nations, it was destined that they would be punished in this world. They would be humiliated because of the fact that they were denying the truth. And this same fate, of course, would be the one that would befall them on the day of judgment. So, in order to make that greater day of judgment a reality, a visually observed reality, these lesser days of judgment in the prophetic era were brought about by the Almighty. And the last time that this happened was in the times of Prophet Muhammad. So, for the Prophet Muhammad, it was said that as far as the idolaters are concerned, people who deliberately associate partners with God, they would be put to death, because this is the same fate that would await them on the day of judgment, because God is not going to forgive polytheism. So what happened was that as far as the polytheists were concerned, or the uh, people of the Prophet's nation were concerned, all of them or most of them accepted faith, and this never, this almost never took place. But for the people of the book who were monotheists and they denied Prophet Muhammad, for them the punishment was that they would be asked to give the jizya tax and remain subservient. So this was a tax which was given as a punishment for not accepting the truth in spite of being convinced about the truth. And this is what the Sahaba did for other nations in the times of the Prophet who were communicated this message, and they denied as well. So, in other words, what I can say is that this is a practice which was specific to the messengers of God. So, punishing people for denying the truth deliberately was something which was meted out by the Prophet, and not making friends with them was, of course, one part of this punishment. They were not worthy of being made friends because they had intentionally denied the truth. They were convinced of the truth and they still denied it. And the truth was not something which was conveyed by people like us, it was by the messengers of God. So, like instruments of God's justice, these messengers of God implemented the verdict of God. And this very practice is specific to God's messengers. Now, what has happened is that there is another verse in the Quran which says that لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, which says that in the personality of the Prophet is the best example for you to follow. So when people thought that the Prophet is also, or his companions were given this directive of punishing people and imposing jizya on them, and they have been told to follow the likes of the Prophet. So, without realizing that this was one exceptional case, or there are a few others as well, in which the Prophet or the messengers of God have this sole prerogative. It is something which is non extendable. It does not relate to the rest of the Muslims, it just relates to messengers of God. So, they ended up doing something which was meant for the messengers of God, and simply by thinking that they have to follow these messengers, they adopted exactly the same procedure. And today, the likes of, for example, Mullah Omar or Osama bin Laden or Abu Bakr Baghdadi, or people who think that they have the same agenda, they actually draw this inspiration from these Quranic verses. So these Quranic verses, which were basically meant for messengers of God, they were thought to have the same message for the rest of the world. And in all sincerity, I would not say that they were insincere people. I would say that they wrongly understood the Quran here, but they made a gross misunderstanding of these verses. And today, as a result, they think that the very agenda which God actually gave the Prophet to implement, we also have the same agenda of punishing people for denying the truth. For one, we just cannot know whether a person is denying the truth or not, because we are not given this communication or this information by God because he doesn't communicate with us. And second, we don't have a messenger of God here today who can communicate the truth to the ultimate extent. So, communicating the truth to the ultimate extent and that deliberate denial was a practice that could only be followed in the prophetic era in which God communicated that deliberate denial and in which messengers of God were present to deliver the truth in such immaculate fashion that it could not be denied. This is not the case with us. So, by not realizing this, we are guilty of, I would say, playing God, something which was God's prerogative, something which was God's initiative, and it was implemented by his messengers and their companions. We erroneously thought that we also are the adversaries of these very directives. So, directives like waging war against disbelievers, like not making friends with them, like, for example, not initiating salutations, like not saying salam to them, similarly, not inheriting from them, and there are a number of other ones which can be enumerated. They all fall into this category, which actually relates to a messenger's mission. And these are basically punishments which God ordained for people for their arrogance. And if we don't understand them, we will end up, as I said, playing the role of God without realizing it.
Absolutely. I think Rasools being God's judgment on earth for their addressees for the purpose of establishing proof of judgment day to come, that is the least talked about aspect of God's message within the Muslim world. It's very, very unfortunate. So, absolutely, as you said, Rasools are God's judgment on earth for their addressees, and all of these verses which deal with fighting others for the sake of establishing faith, all of these verses about punishing people on matters of faith, all of these verses deal with specifically with the Rasul of God, and the last Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, these verses do not apply to us. These verses about that God will make Islam prevail over other religions were specific with the
Mhm.
Rasul.
Right.
God has not asked later Muslims. I know we again represent a minority when we say this, but God has absolutely not demanded it from Muslims after Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam
And
to
one thing that
establish. Yeah,
I
जी sir.
would like to add here is that this doesn't mean that these verses are irrelevant today. You see, the relevance that they have today is that when we read these verses, they give us this message that accountability is going to take place come what may. Why? Because the accountability of these nations took place in this world. And in the post prophetic era, the era in which we are living in, our accountability has been deferred to the day of judgment. If we are not being punished immediately the way those nations were, then we should not think that we will not be punished at all. The only thing is that accountability has been deferred. So the relevance is absolutely there. You have to draw a lesson that their accountability took place in this world, and our accountability is going to definitely take place, if not in this world, then yes, definitely in the next world. So the name of the game, or the reason for making this such a loud and clear call in the Quran, is that we never lose sight of accountability.
Absolutely, absolutely. These verses give us, I think, worldly proof that the promise of accountability, which is to come after we die, is absolutely true because that accountability happened for the last time to the adversaries of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And again, just to repeat it, God did not order Muslims to form any global caliphate after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. God does not ask Muslims to fight non-Muslims on the basis of religion. Or would it be true, sir, to say that now, till the day of judgment, our only relationship with non-Muslims would be based upon us trying to preach our message to them, and they are our brothers and sisters on the basis of humanity? We're all children of Adam and Eve, so we should have this relationship of love and hamdardi and sympathy towards them, and all we can do is just give them the message, and that's it.
Absolutely. You see, what the Quran says is that every single prophet who came on earth brought the same message. The Quran says, Inna Dina indallahi al-Islam, that religion has always been Islam. That is the religion which was brought by all messengers. So the Jews and Christians of their times were actually Muslims. They submitted to Islam. The only thing was that at times they succumbed to deviant practices. So even today, I would call Christians and Muslim and Jews as deviant Muslims, so to speak, because they also follow the same religion, or they were required to follow the same religion. So today, the message that you've absolutely rightly pointed to is that perhaps this is the best time to have this interfaith dialogue, this interfaith discussion, by telling them that we are the same fraternity. We are children of Adam and Eve. We are one big family. We are cousins, and this large family has is got to get together and resolve its differences. And yes, also think that there are certain differences which will never be resolved, because you see there are verses in the Quran at several places which say that there are certain differences which only God will resolve on the day of judgment. Such is the nature of these differences. So let's accept them and learn to coexist, live peacefully with each other, not judge people, do our best, act humbly, present what we think as right. And one thing that I'd especially like to add here, and I do try to practice it myself, is that we must teach and learn the Bible as well and the previous scriptures. So I teach the Bible every week to my students, parts of it, so that to tell them that before the Quran, there were previous books. Yes, they had become, they were lost to posterity. They don't have them in their original language, but that doesn't mean that they contain rubbish at all. I mean, 90% of the content they still have is so close to the Quran, it is so close to your heart that when you read them, you find that they have to be from God. Yes, there are certain interpolations, but then you have the light of the Quran, which can shine on them, and you can tell the right from wrong. So this is absolutely important that when you talk to non-Muslims, you not only present, of course, the Quran, which they already have a thirst to read, but at the same time, we must get acquainted with the Old and the New Testament. We must read parts of it, because you'll just realize after reading them that the Quran and the Bible are from the same source, from the same God, and how perfectly at times they complement one another.
Absolutely. I think this was one of the points which appealed to me the most, that what Quran, the scheme of things that Quran presents, actually, instead of these individual disconnected instances of Prophet Moses, Prophet Jesus, what Quran does, it makes this whole 4,000-year-old thing into a systematic effort of guidance for mankind, which began from Hazrat Adam, peace be upon him, Eve, and ended on Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So it makes everything to a very connected, harmonized effort rather than these individual, disconnected, separate instances happening haphazardly. So that was, I think, that was something that really appealed to me. Okay, so second last point, and then we'll move on to the last point. But we have to make it very short because we're already crossing the time limit. Sir, we know that these misconceptions exist, which seemingly contradict with my inner nature, with universal human morality that we all cherish so much. There are so many that I've written down. For example, a woman's testimony being half that of a man, a woman having to be completely covered, confined to her house. There are so many. Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam marrying a 7-year-old, which, by the way, is absolutely not true. We're saying that Hazrat Aisha's age was at least 17 to 19 when she got married to Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So anybody who is trying to check out Islam and is now faced with these interpretations which contradict, universal morality and the morality within me, what would you suggest to such a person? Where should he go, or where should she go and see and check? Is there any place where they can see a very summarized way that these points are addressed, especially in English language? I know that you've translated some of the books that deal with this topic, sir.
So I think that because all these topics that you have referred to are extremely important and they need some discussion. So there are a couple of books that I have authored on these topics that might be of interest. There's one particularly important book in this regard, which relates to women, Islam and women, misconceptions and misperceptions, in which I have tried to resolve and discuss all these misconceptions, like polygamy, like the witness of women, like women being inferior to men in their intellect, like, for example, wife beating, like the shares of inheritance of daughters being half, and many others. So I think there are about, if I remember correctly, 25 or 30 of these misconceptions, which I have dealt in the light of my understanding that I got from Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi, Ustaz Amin Hassan Islahi, and Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. So on the basis of their research, I have compiled this book. The second book that might be of interest is also of a similar name, and that is Common Misconceptions About Islam, again, which deals with these very common misconceptions of different areas. I have divided into 10 sections related to different areas like women, non Muslims, punishments, political directives, economic directives. So, 10 different areas and five prominent misconceptions from each area. And the third book that might be of interest is the one that I was just referring to in my talk a little while ago regarding non-Muslims. Is a book that I wrote, which is called "Playing God: Misreading a Divine Practice," in which I have enumerated all these directives which have been erroneously been made part of the Sharia, like for example, globally creating a global Muslim empire or a caliphate, or waging war with non-Muslims, or and some of the things that we discussed. So I have enumerated all those directives and shown that how they have been misplaced and they actually belong to the prophetic era. Because of the fact that it will, of course, take time in explaining them, I can only refer you to these three books. And the fourth one, which I which perhaps is not directly related, but which might be of impact, is related to youth issues. You see, one of the very important areas that we need to address is the younger generation and the problems that arise in their minds relating to sexuality, for example, relating to halal or haram, similarly relating to living in the West and how to deal with this dichotomy, that being born Muslims and living in an area in a land in which you have to make this promise that you have to abide by the laws of a non-Muslim country, which might not be at times in uniformity with your own beliefs. So these youth issues, which trouble a Muslim mind a lot. So there is a book which I have written, although it has a different name. It's called Modern Challenges to Parenting. So basically, it's addressed towards parents, but it contains, I mean, all those issues which relate to our younger minds, to the minds of our younger generation, and tries to address them in a way that it might not convince them, but at least it makes them realize that we can discuss and debate every issue. There's nothing as a taboo issue. There's nothing that is indiscussable. We have made our contribution. If you think that this is not something convincing, we can have a discussion and debate, but we have to open the door towards discussion and critical evaluation. And finally, I think the most important thing is this element of critical thinking that we have to inculcate in our young minds, that they are the silent majority. There is this vocal minority which is today spreading the message of Islam, and they might be 0.01%, but whatever they do becomes a symbol of Islam. Whereas this silent minority needs to get themselves educated. They need to come forward and unlearn a lot of concepts that they have learned from their father or mother or mothers or their society, because they are basically based on hearsay. And they must learn religion from its original sources, from authentic scholars, and think that this is a very important area, because each one of us is one day going to be answerable before God. We just cannot, we don't have any excuse when we stand before Him and tell Him that, well, I didn't have the time, or maybe I was too busy, because that's not going to save us. So this is the time that we must realize that this is an opportunity that we have to learn religion from its roots, to learn religion in a way that it invigorates our hearts, it nourishes our soul, it really makes us give that God connection in a very strong way. And we are proud that when we leave this world one day, we will not just leaving, I mean, we might be leaving this world, but we will not be leaving the hearts of people.
Perfect, sir. Last two questions. I know that it's very difficult to answer these questions in a summarized way. So, sir, thank you so much for actually making that effort. So, second last question, because I know a lot of non-Muslims will be listening to this, and they would say that, is the heaven of Islam, is the heaven of Quran only for those people who call themselves Muslim? Because apparently there is a contradiction within the Quran. In one place, Quran says that anyone, whether it be a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, or Sabians, basically meaning everybody else, anybody who believes that I am created by a creator, does good deeds, and believes in the accountability after one's death in this world, they will have nothing to fear on that day. So it's all about believing in God, the day of accountability, doing good deeds, having a good character. But in another place in the Quran, God says that on that day, nothing shall be accepted from you except Islam. So, sir, is heaven only for Muslims, or is it for anybody who is a good human who believes in God and the day of accountability is a good charactered person and does good deeds?
I think that you yourself have very ably answered this question in the very first verse, and you have actually singled out what Islam actually is: to believe in God, to do righteous deeds, and to hold ourselves accountable in the hereafter. This is what exactly Islam is. So, if anyone who adheres to these standards and is not guilty of intentionally denying any other truth, he is an eligible candidate for hell. For heaven. And to be honest, I can say that if this criteria is followed, we might find many Muslims not making it to heaven, and many non-Muslims actually making it to heaven. So I think we there are certain narratives of the Quran of the Prophet Muhammad which have been misunderstood and which give us this impression that only people who will say La ilaha illallah will enter Jannah, and the rest will have no right to paradise. This is absolutely incorrect. The verse that you just pointed out, which says that Inna lazina amanu wal lazina hadu wal nasara was sabaina man amana billahi wal yawmil akhir. And then it goes on to say that all these sects, whether they are Muslims, whether they are Jews, whether they are Christians, whether they are Sabians, if they profess to these three standards, فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, they would have nothing to fear or regret because they would be ending up in heaven. So this is an objective criteria, and it does not just enumerate Muslims. The words are in the lazina amanu wal lazina hadu wal nasara. I mean, Muslims, the Nasara, which are the Christians, the Nazarenes, and the Jews and the Sabians. So I think we have to revisit this verse, and if we do, we will realize that heaven is not the monopoly of Muslims. Heaven is the monopoly of people who submit to God by subscribing to these three criteria, which are mentioned in this verse. And if someone says that, what about belief in Prophet Muhammad? So yes, belief in him, of course, is something which is part of our faith. But for example, if the message of Prophet Muhammad did not reach someone, or it reached it in distorted form, or maybe the actions of Muslims propelled that person to even go away from Islam. So this, or on the other hand, if this is not the case, then someone who believed in Prophet Muhammad and he intentionally denied him, then of course this would not afford him that concession. On the one hand, if any disinformation, misinformation, lack of information could afford him this concession, that in spite of a messenger being conveying the truth to them, he was not able to get to the real message. This, on the one hand, might afford him that concession. But on the other hand, if, for example, the message of a prophet reaches him, and he either he is careless and not even thinking about realizing that, well, he has an obligation towards this message, or he deliberately rejects it, then, for example, even if he subscribes to these three criteria, I'm afraid he would not be eligible. This is much like stating that if a person ascribes to these three criteria and ends up killing someone, or ends up raping someone. So you see, these are the positive requirements which are mentioned. But when you violate these requirements by doing some other crime, then that is another thing that we have to understand, and that would actually override these three criteria. So if you
Perfect.
deliberately deny a messenger, that will override these three criteria.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. Knowingly denying a messenger, or if a Quran's message came to you and you were negligent about it, or if it did make sense to you, but you did not still accept it out of arrogance or worldly benefit, or whatever the reason might be, then that thing applies to you. That yes, on that day, you will be questioned about the fact that my God will say, my messenger's message reached you, and what was your reaction towards it? That will be judged. But yeah, the overall message is believe in God, the day of accountability, do good deeds, have a good character. And sir, what about shirk then? Because God of the Quran does not approve of shirk, and apparently associating partners with God or considering anybody else partner with God is supposedly a very unforgivable sin.
Yes, a deliberate instance of doing shirk. You see, here again, you have to understand that any act of polytheism done in ignorance, maybe, or in spite of some misunderstanding, Like, for example, you see when people go to the graves of saints, they prostrate before them, thinking that this is not in line. I mean, this is in line with monotheism. This doesn't violate in any way the precepts of monotheism. So it's a grave misunderstanding. So I would say that deliberate polytheism, when Quran says, "Inna Allah la yaghfiru an yushraka bihi wa yaghfiru ma duna dhalik," which means that God will not forgive anyone who has committed shirk, but He would forgive any lesser sin. It is actually referring to this deliberate act of doing polytheism. Anything done out of ignorance, misunderstanding, or anything which is, of course, a worthwhile, legitimate pretext in which a person was misled, is not going to be charged the same way. So we have to understand that God's wrath is on those people who know that God is one, who are absolutely convinced that God is one, but out of arrogance, out of vested interests, out of other reasons, they still say, "No, I will not believe in one God, I will believe in multiple gods." This is the polytheism which has been called in the Quran as unforgivable.
Perfect, perfect. So, genuine mistakes, hopefully, inshallah, will be forgiven. If the message genuinely didn't make sense to you, hopefully, then you'll be forgiven and you'll be judged based on your inner morality and your inner knowledge of a higher power and being created by higher power. Sir, last point.
Right.
After having discussed all of these things, I want to ask you a very basic question and take your very personal take on this. Why should anybody bother about God or afterlife? Why should anybody even ask these questions and try to go on this journey? Why?
Well, if we have solved the problem of death, then we don't need to embark on this journey. You see, religion comes in to solve or give an answer that what is going to happen after death. Is life all that there is that we experience? Is there going to be something else after death? Where have we come from? What is our destination? Who has created us? So, if we have found answers to these questions and we are satisfied with these answers, so we don't need religion in any way. And if these answers are worthwhile, we should follow them. But to be honest, I think philosophy has tried its best to give answers to these questions, and it has, if I use a slightly harsh word, it has totally failed in answering these questions. So, religion gives us this answer that what is going to happen after death? What exactly is the scenario that once we pass away, and why? And before that, questions like why at all were we sent in this world? Who created us? Do we have a creator? And if there is a creator, why do we find this merciful creator creating so many miseries and so many problems and hardships which people face? People are born blind, people, women are raped. I mean, there are all kinds of miseries which we can see: poverty and illness and war and strife and hunger, famine. These miseries, they literally shake us to our roots. And if there is a God who has created us and he thinks that he's a merciful God, then there is no answer to this question. Then why should we believe that he's a merciful God? So I think the relevance of religion today is that it actually gives us very certain and logically convincing answers to these very basic philosophical questions, which every mind has in them, unless a person has lulled them to sleep. These are the questions that pop up in the mind of every person who thinks. And I think this is the contribution of religion. And as long as mankind survives on this earth, this is going to remain relevant, because death is something which is going to happen to every one of us.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I know that maybe there will be topics that we haven't covered because of time constraints, and we've talked about things in a very summarized way. So, if you want the detailed take on these things, you can see the literature by Dr. Shehzad Saleem Saab, by Javed Ghamidi Saab. Sir, any last words before we conclude, especially to anybody who is new to Islam or who is checking out Islam for their answers? Any words for them, sir?
I think the thing that comes to my mind is the same, which I think is the test that all of us have been put through, and that is to be a sincere seeker of the truth. We have to be sincere seekers of the truth. Our greatest test is that we should seek the truth, find the truth, abide by the truth, side by the truth. So this is our destiny, and this is also one of the missions that we have been given, that to find what the truth is, and regardless of who is telling the truth, if we think that that is something that convinces us as the truth, then we must abide by it. And this is one of the greatest tests that we have. We must not blindly follow things. We must always be seekers of the truth, and we must be very humble in seeking the truth, never become adamant on what we have formed as a view, because as human beings, we are liable to falter, and there could be people who could correct us, and even our own rethinking could correct our previous thoughts. So, becoming humble seekers of the truth. This is the message that I have learned from my teachers, and this is the lesson that I would like to convey to your viewers as well.
Thank you so much, sir. It was my privilege actually to take your opinion on these questions, and inshallah, hopefully, we'll keep talking with frequent intervals. Thank you again so much for giving us your time, sir. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you very much.